in the Old Testament, in Genesis, there's this notion that not only did people become self-conscious because they did something, but they did this voluntarily, right? They made this decision on their own. So Milton puts words into God's mouth and says, "So will fall he," meaning the human being, "and his faithless progeny, whose fault? Whose but his own? Ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall." And then you think, well, maybe the notion of the heritable sin of Adam characterizing human beings and their fallen existential condition isn't just the black-hearted ravings of fundamentalist Southern Baptist lunatics, right? There's something to this. Human beings are the only creatures that seem to live at odds with their own experience, and it's not so unreasonable to suppose that it's our dawning capacity for self-consciousness that's put us in that uncomfortable position. So why do I associate the eating of the apple with self-consciousness? Well, it's because that's how the story lays itself out. You have the collateral evidence of the Buddha's story of enlightenment, right? His contact with death. You have multiple medieval representations of Eve offering to Adam not an apple but a skull. You have multiple representations of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in medieval iconography as not containing apples but containing skulls. And you have the statements that are within the context of Genesis itself. And the eyes of both of them were opened. And they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Well, there's a lot of information packed into those two lines, right? What does it mean to have your eyes open? Well, half your brain is visual cortex. It's not unreasonable to presume that that means a quick magnification of consciousness. You're conscious during the day. That's when your eyes are open. Well, what happens when your eyes are open? Well, you know you're naked. Well, what does that mean? Well, you know you're vulnerable, right? To social comment, to social judgment, to dominance, hierarchy, status maneuvering, and to all the terrible things that the unknown world can wreak upon you. And so then what do? Well, you create culture, right? And that's what this little sentence says. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. It's a pretty eventful sequence, all crammed up in two little sentences. So then what happens? I think it's extremely interesting. So before Adam and Eve figure out that they're naked, they're cruising around the garden having a fine time, doing whatever they want. They don't take any thought for the future, right? They don't have a prefrontal cortex. They're living in a paradoxless environment, like an animal lives. Well, what happens after they become self-conscious? Well, prior to this, Adam's walking around with God, right? And you think about what that means. It means something like this. An animal isn't in the world of good and evil. An animal, like nature points out, is beyond good and evil, right? Enraptured entirely by the actions of automatic instinct, governed by processes that are completely transcendent. The animal's nothing but a force of nature. There's no opposition between the animal and the world. The animal is the world. And just as in the case of the animal, prior to the eating of the apple, Adam walks around the garden with God. There's no discontinuity between him and the transcendent world as such. But as soon as he becomes naked, he hides. Well, why? Well, that doesn't need to be answered. All you have to do is think about it. Why would you hide if you know you're naked? Well, it's simple. You hide because you think you can get hurt. You think that whatever you are is so vulnerable that if it shows itself to the transcendent, to others, to the natural world, that something terrible will happen. And then you think, well, that's a pretty logical presupposition, right? Look at us. So God comes cruising around the garden after Adam and Eve eat the apple in the cool of the day, and Adam and Eve hide themselves among the trees of the garden. And God says to Adam, "Hey, where are you?" And Adam says, "I heard your voice, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." And that story has bottomless depth Because it means something like this. At the beginning of Genesis, there's this notion that there's a transcendent relationship between the individual and God, right? The identity of Logos and the individual. Right? A notion, by the way, that our entire idea of intrinsic human right is predicated on, as we've been at some pains to demonstrate. A relationship between the limited and the limitless, eradicated by the dawn of self-consciousness. So what does that mean? Well, let's say you have a destiny, just for the sake of argument, right? Because you are a being with a tremendous history and an unbelievable potential. So let's say you have a destiny, just for the sake of argument. What would cause you to hide from that destiny? Well, obviously, your own reflections on your mortal vulnerability, right? How could I be characterized by any transcendent power whatsoever when I'm susceptible to social alienation, right? When I have this body which is capable of terrifying degeneration that will eventually decay into old age and that is bounded by death. How could I be good for anything? Which is precisely what this little story says. And so God figures out that Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and that's a pretty decisive move, because once you wake up, sorry, you're awake. And he says, and this is not an injunction, by the way, this is a description. All right, you've done it now. Unto the woman, he says, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. Why? Why? And thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. This is not an injunction, this is a description. The additional burden that dependent offspring place on women, place them at a disadvantage. What's the consequence of that from a historical perspective? Well, any feminist can answer that question, right? And unto Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and have eaten the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, don't eat that. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it for all thy days of thy life. Fair enough, right? Once you're self-conscious, you work. Why? Well, animals don't work. Why do people work? Well, because we know, right? We know that if it isn't going to happen today, it's going to happen tomorrow. And if it isn't going to happen tomorrow, well, it's going to happen next week, or the week after, the month after, the year after. And we bloody well better prepare. So that's what we do. Constantly prepare and prepare and prepare. So we're not bounded and motivated by what's happening from second to second, like the animal is in its still paradisal state. We're constantly tormented by an endless string of what-if questions, because when we look at the unknown, we can see the possibility for everything, including our own punishment, our own torment, our own demise. And so we're motivated, like no other animal, to work. And so we work. But that is another aspect that alienates us from paradisal being. Thorn and thistles shall it bring forth for thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Right. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden, to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life. Adam and Eve, right, the mother and father of all humanity. So you can give them a mythological slant, and you can say, Adam is culture, say, and Eve is nature. Because they're the archetypal parents, it's a perfectly reasonable interpretation. They have twin sons, Cain and Abel. So let's read firstborn creatures, firstborn human creatures, in the new self-conscious world. So what are the first two individuals in the new self-conscious world like? And let's find out. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And again she bare his brother Abel, the younger brother. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. Okay, so we're going to remove this from this story from its entrapment in a particular temporal domain, and within a temporal culture, we're going to say something like this. Well, if you work, you make sacrifices, right? That's what work's all about. And the reason you make sacrifices is because you're offering up to the unknown the fruits of your labor, in the hope that as a consequence of your diligent effort, you're going to be favored, right? Because otherwise, why work? The point of working is to transform the transcendent into something benevolent. So you work and you work and you work and you say, is that sufficient? And the answer you get from the transcendent is the answer. Now, it's certainly true that lots of people work and it doesn't go all that well, right? They make sacrifices and they do what they think they have to do, and their life is one string of catastrophes after another, right? So we have this situation. In the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering. So what that means is that old Abel, working away, man, things are going great for him, right? Fortune smiles on him. He's doing wonderfully. He's got everything he needs. Well, old Cain, he's scrounging away in the ground, and things aren't going as well for him at all, right? Plagues, locusts, you name it. Farm life isn't going well. So what happens? Well, Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. Well, precisely, right? Because if you work diligently towards a certain end and you don't get there, then your countenance falls, right? You're angry, frustrated, disappointed, hurt, anxious, threatened, ashamed, guilty, the whole panoply of negative emotions. And that's fair enough, because of course if you fail, that's what's going to be the consequence. But then there's this little twist on it, right? This specifically human twist. It's like the kind of moral of the whole story. And so you find the Lord saying, oh, well, you know, what's up with you? Why are you so unhappy? If you just got your act together, then you'd be accepted. If you really got your act together, which is a statement something like this. If you keep making sacrifices and the same terrible thing keeps happening, there's always the possibility that you're just actually not doing it the right way. And if you just get yourself straightened up, tapped together, right, and drop the preconceptions that you don't really need and adjust your behavior accordingly, then fortune would smile on you. And that's exactly what the Lord says to Cain, right? You don't walk around with such a crabby look on your face. If you did well, you'll be accepted. And if you don't do well, sin lies at the door. So what does that mean? Well, this is a deep motif in ancient Hebrew thinking. If the world isn't laying itself out in a manner that you find acceptable, you're faced with a tough choice. Either the world is a terrible place bent on your destruction, or you're doing something wrong. And it bloody well better be that you're doing something wrong. Because if the world is a terrible place bent on your destruction, you've got absolutely no hope